People said a lot of things about old Mother Tallow. The first, which everyone knew, was that she was definitely a witch. She had lived up there on top of that hill for as long as anyone could remember. Longer. And she was rumoured to have been involved somehow in some children disappearing once upon a time. Simon didn't really listen to rubbish like that. He was much more interested in the second rumour, which definitely seemed to be true. She was supposed to be blind, and as he sat there on that garden wall watching her work away on her apple trees, he could see that her eyes were large, white and milky, and that she worked on the apple trees by touch, her gnarly old hands reaching along the bent and crooked apple trees until they found a new branch sticking out bright and green from the side. She immediately picked up a pair of shining secateurs and snipped it off. He watched her do this for some time and thought about the third rumour, the most important rumour. You see, she was supposed to be absolutely stinking rich. She'd lived an incredibly long life, and there was absolutely no evidence that she'd spent any money at all. Her house was small and broken down, her garden was overgrown and battered. Nothing seemed to be cared for, apart from the 4 apple trees that grew out of the centre, which she tended all of the time. Simon was sick of being the kid at school who always had the second-hand shoes, who never had the new toy. If she didn't want to spend that big pot of money, well, he'd definitely be able to think of something to do with it. As he sat, he saw that her front door had been left open as she worked in the garden, and he knew this was the moment. Silently, he stepped down from the garden wall. At that moment, some birds flew from the holly bush behind him, and the old lady turned in his direction and stared, her white eyes glowing like a cat's. Simon didn't dare move for what felt like an eternity, until the old lady tilted her head in a couple of directions, listening hard, deciding nothing was wrong, and carried on with her work on those old, gnarly apple trees. Keen to be as far away from her as possible, Simon crept along the edge of the overgrown grass to get to the house and step through that door, but it meant he had to get a little bit closer than he wished to the hideous old crone, whose intensity and strange joy in her horrible snipping was, frankly, not pleasant to watch. He was pleased to be able to get out of her sight when he dipped into the house. He felt pleased and proud of himself as he stepped into the old lady's home, and only had to crush a very small feeling of guilt down to the bottom of his stomach. But his pleasure was pretty short-lived. As he looked around the house, he saw that the whole thing was one medium-sized room. Everything in that one space. A battered-looking old bed, a broken stove in one corner, a couple of chests of drawers, nothing really. Hardly the pot of gold he was hoping for. He decided to look around anyway. Hearing that people sometimes kept money under their beds, he reached under the duvet and found nothing. He rummaged through the drawers, pulling things out and throwing them in every direction. Nothing of any value. He even looked inside the oven, which he found cold and empty and bare. Slamming it shut, dejected, he turned around and decided to go back out of the building and get out of there. And that's when he saw it. A wooden table, carved with curvy legs, on top of which sat a frankly beautiful wooden box. It was so carefully cared for, unlike everything else in the house, it seemed to glow and entice him in. As he walked over, he could see that the top of it had been carved into the form of 5 beautiful apple trees, heavy with fruit. Breathlessly, he lifted the polished lid and found it to be full of £50 notes. They didn't even look like they'd been touched. They were completely new and crisp, and you couldn't have got a single extra £50 note in that box, even if you tried, even if you'd forced it down. He picked up the whole thing, as big and rectangular and heavy as a brick, and forced it into his fleece pocket, zipping it up so it wouldn't go anywhere. He smiled wolfishly at his prize and decided to leave at that moment. Why waste any more time? He stepped carefully out the door, looked round the corner, and saw that the old lady, no idea what was going on, was working away still on her hideous, pointless, stupid old apple trees. He stepped across the lawn, smiling at his new rewards, when there was a flash as bright as a firework going off. He seemed to lose consciousness. Sometime later, who knows how long, he woke up and had the horrible feeling there'd been some kind of terrible injury that he couldn't quite describe. He could feel nothing. His face was numb, and he couldn't move it. He looked around and saw that he was in the same garden, but unable to move. His feeling came back. He felt his body freezing cold. The wind seemed to drive straight through him. He also could feel something like pinpricks upon his fingers. He looked to his left and right and saw branches. Had the crazy old woman tied him to one of the apple trees? But it was something worse. The pinpricks he felt along one of his fingers, when he saw and looked, were a very small bird stood on one of the tiny branchlets. Back and forth it moved, and he could feel every pinprick of its tiny claws until a tiny pressure as it jumped and flew away. He wasn't tied to one of the apple trees. Somehow, he'd become one of the apple trees. Old Mother Tallow loomed to view, her face close to what used to be his, her secateurs shining in what left of the sun. "Oh, we're going to have to do a lot of work to this one," she said. "A lot of work." She groped blindly along one of his arm branches until one of his finger branchlets, and with the secateurs carefully snipped. He screamed horribly, hideously, silently. Only the birds heard, the birds in the holly bush across the road, and as they flew into the sky and over the uncared-for garden, over the old lady, over the broke-back cottage, and over the 5 apple trees, his scream carried on. That reminds me, I've got some work to do myself. Sweet dreams.